Hello and welcome to the aForm show. My name is Alan George and thank you very much for tuning in. Each week, we sit across from thought leaders and change makers in the architecture and design space of the GCC. We dive deep into their experiences, both professionally and personally, and share their valuable insight as to what makes them tick. Our goal is to add value to your day and help you navigate your own personal creative journey. Finally, the opinions and the views of the guest speakers are that of their own. They do not necessarily represent the views and the opinions of the show or the host. Welcome to the show, everyone. Today we have someone truly special with us with over 3 decades of professional practice. Today we are joined by Darryl Custer. He is the Managing Director of the Design Division at KEO International Consultants. With a vast portfolio of work across North America and Asia, Darryl brings a unique global insight to our GCC sector. We are truly excited to have him on the show today. So without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome to the show, Darryl. Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, I know that we're most likely going to be short on time because the minute I realized you were going to make it onto the show, I just had so many things I want to talk about. So I'm going to refine them as much as I can so that we can get the most out of our conversation today.
Super.
So obviously the very first thing that strikes me is that I know we were talking about this off air as well, that you kind of bring truly an outsider perspective to this industry because you've been kind of all around except the GCC till recently, I would imagine. So I guess I want to start off with, for someone like yourself, what was the appeal about the GCC sector and specifically about the UAE from your eyes?
So thanks again for having me on the show. For me, as an architect, I've over the years evolved more and more towards urban mixed use, which has also leaned more towards community and placemaking. So I try to always be involved in projects and focus on projects that are about community and building communities. And so in the Middle East, I think what I saw was enormous opportunities as we sort of transition. I think the whole planet is at a big transition point with, technology, issues with climate change, all of the different confluences of trigger points, I think is bringing change. And I think in the Middle East, I saw a batch of challenges that maybe were new for me. Probably the biggest one being the topic of mobility. So, what I've seen here is that a lot of the communities here are based on a car. And, obviously over the next 50 years, there's going to be a lot of transition around that, whether it's, oil going to electric or robotic or even flying, vehicles. I think it's going to bring tremendous evolution in how we design buildings and how we design communities and how these things are all interconnected. In my mind, I see tremendous challenges and also tremendous opportunities here in this region that, maybe were less so in where I was at before. So, for me, it's a good time to be here because we're, at the beginning stages of it. So I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. So do you think, is that the kind of sentiment for the overall sector? Because that would also lump in, I guess, all of MENA. So even Egypt, Saudi, UAE, is that the kind of sentiment you're seeing all across?
Yeah, I think so. I think in the end, the model for what an urban context is somewhat similar across the board. People, when you think of a city, most people have a certain idea in their mind. And I guess what I'm saying is that model may change very quickly and look something more like, what you see in futuristic movies, and I don't want to sort of get off topic here, but, to me, what I think of, when I talk to developers here and people here is that you've got a lot of the design and development culture here is based on single use projects. So it's a residential building, or it's a shopping mall, or it's an office tower, or it's a hospital, or it's this, or it's that. And I think personally where we're headed, one, because of technology and mobility and the things I was talking about earlier, and two, because of how people are living now on the tail end of COVID. Well, I hope tail end of COVID and lifestyle changes. I think we're migrating to a true mixed use model where what we're going to start seeing, or what I think a good solution or a good model going forward is vertically stacked integrated projects where it's more all in one. Things are interconnected. Maybe there's smaller pieces of more components, So you may have projects where it's got a mixture of, well, I'll go back. So in the old days, in the 90s and even 20 years ago, a mixed use project generally had 2 or 3 uses. Anything more than one was considered mixed use. Right. Then you got into these sort of 4 mixed uses. And now, starting to see projects where you might have 5 types of uses. You might have residential, retail, office, healthcare, leisure, and so they're getting more complex and more integrated and more dense, which I think is really cool. And then, and that's so project to project. And then how those projects connect, I think is going to get more complex. So if in the current model, the ground plane is the end all to be all. So most people, everybody arrives on grade on a car or a bus or whatever that mode of transportation is. In the future, we may see more 3-dimensional stacking. You might see more either underground, so, 2, or you may see aerial, So I think it brings a really interesting level of complexity. And it also changes how these projects are designed. So, one of the limitations to mixed use or any project right now is the arrival sequence and how you get in and out. Right. Well, if you can open the door to, say, having your hotel lobby on the 10th floor and not having to go in on the ground floor and go up to it, you arrive directly up there via SkyCab or Skybus or aerial drone or whatever that is to get you there. Imagine how that changes how that project's designed and what it'll look like and what the experience is and everything else. I've always, for years, we've always said, the roof is the 5th facade. Well, it really becomes more than just, where you put your mechanical units. It's something you see because you're coming in from above. So, to me, I think those are all things that are coming. And I do think, to answer your question, I think it is across the board, whether you're in Egypt or here in Dubai or say in Riyadh. So, it's pretty exciting stuff.
Okay. It then sort of, because at the moment I think I have my architect hat on. So I think I completely agree. I do think that that's where our field is going, and we are going to have to challenge a lot of norms, which we maybe didn't before. One of the conversations we had in the podcast with one of our earlier guests was, what if, eventually the car goes away? What do we do with all these sort of car parking podiums at the bottom of these skyscrapers if no one's going to have cars anymore? Can developers now have DCRs which envision that these may need to be car parking now, but can be modeled or remodeled into something else maybe a decade or 2 later? Things like arrival at the rooftop as compared to arrival on the ground floor, or arrival maybe 15 floors into a basement level, because that's where you have your transit route, for example. They're all kind of conversations which it's good to see that designers are having at the moment. But my question to that always is that obviously an architect's role is fairly generic, but then also has its own sort of specifics. But when you start thinking about integrating so many other sort of disciplines into the field of architecture, for example, the kind of projects that we're talking about at the moment obviously require high levels of engineering, specifics, infrastructure, even technology, AI, and so on and so forth. So I guess my question is, as an architect, do we need to know all of that? Or do we need to know how to collaborate with other people who know more? What, in your opinion, would be the best way forward?
Well, I think certainly collaboration's important. I don't think, the more complex the world gets, the more it requires everybody to have an open mind and be able to work, for a common good. But, it's interesting for me, the question about coming to this region had a lot to do with where I came to. So KEO, one of the reasons I joined KEO is because the design division that I'm working with now has multidisciplinary. So we have structural, we have MEP, we have all of those. And the idea is to really build a team that can cover a lot of these things in-house, but then also work with, other consultants who bring talent to the table. So I think that's one of the things I'm excited about is sort of looking at it in more holistic terms. But I do agree with what you're saying. And, to me, the most simplest analogy is I personally believe that buildings of the future are going to look more like a Tesla car than a static building. And I don't mean architectural. I'm not talking about the aesthetic of it. I'm saying how they function. And, the best example, is you say, art imitates life or vice versa. If I look at, say, Blade Runner 2049, S2E19.
Awesome
It's
movie.
a really good example of, and I'm not talking about the dystopian part of it, but if you look at the scenes where he's in his apartment and the main character comes in and he's got an avatar speaking to him that's connected to the apartment, and she knows what kind of food he likes, what kind of, light levels, air conditioning, the temperature, all of that, I think is sort of an interconnected live building that's connected to the humans who use it. And I think that's, where things are headed. And so, but to pull that off, to your point, it requires, an architect being able to talk to a futurist who's able to talk to an electrical engineer who can communicate with a mechanical engineer and a structural, and, on and on it goes. It really is going to require teams that can really think through these things and also adapt for what's next after that, which might be, robotics, where, you'll have buildings that can evolve and change, or movable. I mean, I generally think, if the sort of current model is a building that's fairly static, you design it, it's got columns, it's got floor slabs, it's got windows, it's got all of these things that are fairly static. In the future, these are going to be live, connected, and movable.
All right, and we're back. We're not going to edit this out. So for everyone wondering, yes, I was a fire alarm. We are all safe. Darryl, I, and Jassim made it out all good. Much love to DCD for keeping us on our toes, I must say. So, swiftly moving back to our conversation, Darryl. I know we kind of digressed a bit, and we might have to come back on track. But we were talking about how architects need to sort of work collaboratively with other specialists. Like you said, an architect be able to talk to a futurist, be able to talk to, someone else in innovation and so on. Whilst that is good for designers, I kind of want to get your insight as to what developers think of this. When you as an architect go into a meeting and you pitch, these are the ideas that we want to do, this is the team we want to work with. What's their kind of reaction? Are they on board? Are they sold? Are they nervous? What's the kind of feedback?
Well, it's kind of a mixture, and I think a lot of it depends on the project at hand or what their business goals are for the project that we're working on with. So it's not so much a developer point of view as much as it is about what the goal is for the project. And for me, I've always felt like architects are problem solvers. I know in the end it's about pure building design, but really it's about solving problems, or at least for good architects. And so if you can have the conversation about, okay, what's the issue? What's the problem? How do we come up with ideas to solve those problems? So to your earlier point about, parking, and if we're building parking structures that are designed for people to come and park their car every day and then work and then leave, and maybe there's no demand for that in the future. One idea to sort of backfill in there is data storage, urban farming. There's no reason you couldn't take a parking deck that's 5 levels above grade or below and convert that into an urban farm. We have the technology now. I think it's more of an economic issue. And so it's really, to me, as a designer and architect, is about having those kinds of conversations. And then the architectural solutions are derivative of that. It's like, well, how do we work together, and how do we help you figure out what is a workable model as we move forward? And in some cases, it's a, built-in flexibility. In some cases, it's about, transition. And in some cases, it's about, what's that next big idea? But I think it's different, to answer your question, with each project.
Okay. I think the overall conversation about the GCC is that we're in this, like you said, pivotal position where, things are kind of ripe for this kind of change to happen. The GCC sector, obviously, in comparison to other market sectors, is a fairly young sector. I'm curious then to know from you, because you've obviously seen markets which are a lot more mature, have developed a lot more organically, a lot more longer even. Do you see any sort of parallels between how markets have developed, between how the GCC could be going as compared to, say, somewhere else?
Yeah. In my mind, so the more developed, longer term markets, it's about return on investment, because most of the players in the game, it's about just, getting that next project up and running. And I work almost entirely in the private sector. So it's, most of my clients are developers. It's about commercial development, and it's about return. In Asia and say in some of the other markets that I've been in, it's that plus the look at me kind of architecture. It's about making that big statement. And I think here in the Middle East, it's sort of all of that, but more pronounced. So in some markets, it's very much about precedence and just getting that return. But one of the things I'm really interested in here is this idea about, the look at me architecture and, wanting to make a statement,
right.
which I think is a bit scary in some kinds, it can be a bit kitschy if you let it be, but it also opens the door to being able to try new things. So I think, right. When you look at some of the most interesting projects in the world now are here because of this desire to sort of do something new and different. And to me, I think that's what I think makes this part of the world special and that it brings opportunities. I mean, I look at, the new Museum of the Future and, there's not a lot of places that a building like that could be built for a number of reasons. And so as a piece of architecture and as a piece of art, I appreciate that for what it means in the industry,
Right.
And so to me, that's pretty interesting, that balance of sort of, precedence and doing sort of rational, I would say, projects
right.
combined with the ability to maybe throw out some new ideas is kind of a neat mixture, I think.
Okay. Just to be devil's advocate, don't you think the kind of look at me architecture, obviously I'm assuming that any developer who has any project probably wants that kind of statement. Do you think that is probably not a good thing? And maybe there should be quote unquote background buildings for the look at me buildings. So if everyone kind of wants to go down the route of, we want to be iconic, we want, the look at me feel, isn't that a bad thing in the long term?
I think it's only a bad thing if that's all you're building and getting. I think like everything in life, balance is what brings a healthy environment. So I think as long as it's, and if you look at a photograph of the Museum of the Future, you'll see a bunch of more rational, prototypical buildings behind it. So I think as long as, we've got a balanced situation going on, then it's fine. I think it's a good thing because, a little bit of, to me, it's like, does it get people thinking and talking? And I think as long as, that's what we're doing, then, so be it. I've also seen other buildings around the world. Well, look at like, say, the Bilbao, the Guggenheim, or the museum in Spain. Whether you like it or not, the idea that it's there, I think, is a good thing because it gets a conversation going and it really put that city back on the map from a global perspective. And so I'm not speaking to the architectural design, but what it means for the industry and it's like fine art in a way, I think as long as it gets people talking and if it serves a purpose, then it's a good thing.
Fair enough. Speaking of getting people talking and thinking, a topic of discussion which is quite prevalent now in the industry is the whole sort of next decade or two with the 2040 master plan for Dubai and essentially feeding into the entire country. As I'm sure you're aware that master plan promises a lot and is kind of in line with the kind of vision that you and I are talking about as well right now. That's the kind of direction that plan is going down as well. I would want to hear from someone like yourself because you obviously see a very big picture when it comes to, urban design and planning and so on. What are your thoughts on the 2040 master plan?
It's very ambitious and I would expect nothing less, but to me, I think it's all good, especially when you look at the top line goals and the objectives. I agree with all of them. I guess what I would be cautious about is when you start to see the renderings and you start to see the videos and the illustrations where everything's green in this lush green landscape, which I think may pose some challenges, if for no other reason than water, right? Water is the biggest issue about living in building here. And so I think trying to balance those goals against the reality of the resources that we have on hand is going to be the biggest challenge with that vision. Now, the other thing I would say is, as an urbanist and as somebody who's really interested in community placemaking, again, I agree with the overall vision, but to sort of, to script out 5 distinct districts is a good thing. But if it were me, I'd say, well, let's focus on 2 or 3, make those really good, and then let those areas radiate out from them and connect up. And so maybe in the end, what you have are these pods where you've got these livable communities that are connected with high-speed rail or connected through other means with, desert in between as one way of looking at it, as a logical growth path. But, I think a lot of it is, you've got to sort of start with the next 5 years and go from there. So breaking those milestones down into shorter increments might also be a good thing.
Right.
I've always felt like really good urban livable communities, really from a planning perspective, it's like the pond in the water where it hits and the waves go out.
Right.
It's kind of like that. So if you said, let's pick 3 urban hubs that we already have, make those really work, and then let them radiate out and then connect to create a sort of megalopolis, I think is probably a more rational approach than just saying we're going to make everything green and it's going to be perfect, in my view.
Right. Interesting. I think if I were to sort of take the same pond analogy, I think that's kind of how Saudi is approaching their development, in the sense that except their sort of interventions are at a city scale, not really just a project. I mean, they're literal cities that are coming up. But I think if I were to look at this sort of development with, the Red Sea, and then you have Alula and all of that, I feel like they kind of have the same approach, wherein they want these kind of hubs, these nodes, and then have them sort of organically grow out to each other. Do you think the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have a plan, which is good, right? That's the first step. I think what when I go over there, and you start talking to all these giga developers and you start seeing the portfolio of projects that are on the horizon, it's hard to imagine that all of that's going to get built. I think from the human side, the consultant industry is rallying around it, and you're going to see lots and lots of people moving there. It's in place right now. People are already moving there. So I think the ability to draw, design, engineer, all of these things is realistic. I think where the challenge comes in is supporting it with actual resources, physical resources. There's only so much concrete in the world. There's only so much steel in the world. There's only so and so how you support, if you map out all of the plans in the kingdom, and then you map that against the amount of physical resources that are available in the GCC, it's hard to imagine all of those things happening. Now, that doesn't mean that most of it won't. I don't know. I'm sure somebody's looking at this and doing the math, but I guess what I'm saying is hopefully they're prioritizing it and putting it in a way that balances these new communities and the look at me architecture with what these communities need. So housing for people, and they are, in fairness. I mean, I think there are developers there that are building massive amounts of housing for the people that live there. And that's going to be critically important, is not just putting these, projects like NEOM on the map so that everybody in the world's looking at it, but balancing that with making sure that the people who are there are getting what they need to support, a sustainable, healthy lifestyle. So you're lifting the entire country up. Right. I think that's what's going to be critically important. And some community, I've seen this in my past in Asia, in different parts where I was, you don't always see that. Sometimes you see these brand new glitzy developments and then you realize it's for people coming in. And so my hope is in the kingdom that it is balanced. And I think it is. I think their plan includes a lot of that.
Right. Interesting. Because, I think the Saudi population, Saudi nationals, again, in my mind, because I've only ever, visited ever so infrequently. And you kind of just hear about, citizens and nationals over there and so on, the kind of lifestyle that they have. And for the longest time, prior to this sort of, boom from MBS, it was always that, Saudis would come to, the UAE, Dubai specifically, to visit for Eid and things like that. Although over the last few years, I've sort of seen this reverse migration happen, wherein people from the UAE are now going to, places like Riyadh and so on, which is really interesting. And I think that gives a lot of opportunity, number one. And I think if they are going to do it the way that you're saying, sounds pretty promising. It's very, very hopeful along the horizon. I kind of maybe want to switch gears a bit. I feel that it would be very imperative for our audience, who are predominantly sort of young professionals, mid-level professionals, to hear from someone like yourself about your career. It's, I don't want to give too much away, and I kind of want you to give us a brief snapshot if you can, and kind of conclude it with a piece of advice that you can give someone who's young, mid-level, looking to build a career out of this field, not just kind of make this a job, if you may.
Well, for starters, I feel like I've been very lucky. I mean, I've been lucky in the sense that I've always had access to just super talented, brilliant minds and great clients, and I've always tried to learn as much as I could from the people that I've worked with, above and below, honestly. That being said, the two key things I always say is, try to figure out what you're good at and then try to figure out what you enjoy. And in most cases, if you can match those two things, then everything else will work itself out. And it's, I don't know if you're familiar with the Ikigai, and I'm not a Japanese philosopher or anything like that, but there's this fundamental lifestyle that's based on, Ikigai that's all about that. It's like doing what you enjoy and doing what you're good at, and then letting, and within that finding purpose, and then within that purpose, everything else falls in line. And so I think in terms of career growth, when I talk to staff and people that I work with, it's interesting to me that, when in our early days, the educational system, at least in America, which is where my education was based on a U.S. program, high school is 4 years, college, when I was getting my Bachelor of Architecture, was 5 years. And I think that's pretty consistent across the world. Most people work in these sort of 4 to 5 year increments, and then you graduate, and even postgraduate, it goes in like 4 year chunks. For most people, they graduate and they go off with their life, and it's like, okay, well, now I'm going to do this for 40 years. And so I always kind of question that and say, well, what I try to do when I work with people is to view their career in 4 year increments, so say, all right, maybe you have an idea of where things will be 30 years from now, but don't worry about that. Just focus on the next 4 years. Okay. What are you doing now? And what do you think you might enjoy doing 4 years from now? Or how does what you're doing, what's it going to look like in 4 years? And, within that, who are the people that are doing the things that you might want to be doing? And a lot of it really is about this idea of mentorship and mentoring and being mentored and mentoring others and paying it forward. That whole philosophy it requires people to sort of be cognizant of these core things that I'm talking about, So if you have an idea of where you want to be in 4 years, and you have an idea of the 3 or 4 people that are doing that, and you can start a conversation with them, chances are you'll get there without even knowing it. And the other thing I would say is, after you get in, say 10 years into your career, I always encourage people to pay it backwards the other way. You gotta, if you're not working with people and helping them, then you're sort of, you're helping yourself by doing that, but you're also, you're continuing the chain, so to speak. That's kind of my philosophy. I have charts and graphs that show all these things too. I used to do, with a lot of training in my current firm, and, we do it at KEO. We have a mentorship program that we're doing. And in my previous firms, I would make this chart that showed, sort of core skills. So, is it design focused? Do you want to get involved in management? Do you want to get involved in marketing? Do you want to be, technically oriented? Do you want to be the best spec writer? What are those core things? And, we all, when you come out of school, there's sort of a base of information you should have as an architect. And what I've always said is, if you look at it from a pyramid point of view, from a good to great mentality. So say, I'm really good at these 10 things, but I want to be great at this one thing. Right. How are you going to get there? Well, if you say, well, that's the end all, the be all, you're going to struggle. But if you can sort of back it down and say, okay, in 4 years, maybe these are the 5 or 6 things I'm going to focus on. And then 4 years after that, it's 3 things. And then 4 years after that, it's 2 things. And then, and so on and so forth. And you're essentially, you're trying to become an expert at something. So this earlier conversation about collaborating and working together, well, that requires expertise. And so if you take at the top line, so the best project delivery you could ever have, say, would be an expert in it. If you look at like NASA, or you look at a spaceship, right? That's how when they select a crew, it's like, well, we have these 12 core needs. Right. So we want the very best person in this field. That's the team. So to me, I view sort of architecture in a similar way. It's kind of like you want to build expertise in that can work together.
As a kind of final question to the episode, this is kind of a question which is open-ended. You don't have to answer it. You can take your time and respond to it, but it's kind of just to see where your sort of design thinking is heading towards. So the question on the show is, we refer to it as the utopian question, and by definition is a utopia. This is a client that comes to you and says, hey, Darryl, completely believe in you and your team. Here's pretty much a blank check with a plot that I want to develop. The only constraint to this project being whatever you want to build and design in this plot needs to give back to the community in whichever sense you want to take that. So it can be quite literally, generating electricity, feeding back to the grid. It can be more philosophical in many other senses. So if you were to get this utopian client to show up, what are you building?
I would build a very large, vertically stacked, mixed-use community that was, preferably net zero, but had enough that the people there could live a healthy life. So urban farming, lifestyle amenities, food and beverage, entertainment, flexible work environment, healthcare amenities. So basically an all-in-one mixed-use community that also was flexible long-term and, eventually had capabilities of integrating AI and other, future technologies. But I think the biggest thing would be, trying to get a project that could be net zero, that truly could not contribute to some of the negative effects that we've seen from the built environment.
Right.
Would be what I would really hope to do, or something like that.
No, that sounds like a place I'd want to live for sure, and is definitely very consistent with our entire podcast. I would say so far. Yeah. That's the kind of language that we're talking about, and I really do think like we're going to see a lot more of those kind of projects being attempted very soon. They may not be successful on their first go, but I feel like there's definitely going to be multiple attempts at getting that sort of model done correctly.
Yeah,
and that's very cool. So, Darryl, on that note, on behalf of the show, I wanted to thank you for giving us your time. I'll be the first one to admit this was a very challenging episode for multiple reasons, but thank you for giving us your time and powering through. It means a lot to us.
Yeah, thank you. It was good. Appreciate it.
Awesome. And for the rest of you guys, we will catch you guys next week. Fellow aFormers, thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for being part of our journey, and thank you for the immense support we've been receiving for our episodes. It has and continues to be a very bumpy road, but we wouldn't want it any other way. If you enjoyed this episode and it brought you value, please share this episode with anyone who may benefit from it. But of course, if you loved the episode, follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn, send us a little DM, and we may just send you a secret link to a secret episode which we've been working on. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. See you next time. Keep sketching.